Thanks for checking out the Real Finds podcast. On the podcast today, we have Drew Cunningham. Drew is the CEO of the Dilweg Companies, a real estate investment firm focused on investing in the Southeast. On the podcast, we talk about short-term and flex work, the future of flex work, how to manage and really get into the weeds of flex work companies. And then we talk a little bit more about implementing flex work strategies for a traditional office portfolio. If you're an office investor, if you're looking at changing up your portfolio, this is a must listen episode. Drew, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, why real estate? What got you into the business?
Oh gosh, not really a very complicated answer. I went to Villanova University. I went to the business school there, and when I graduated, I needed a job. And like everybody else who graduates college, and I had an opportunity with a townhome developer in New York, and it just sounded really interesting, so I went for it, and that's what started me.
So, you've worked for some of the biggest names in the business and worked for some pretty large REITs. I'm curious, the office is dead narrative is out there everywhere. Everyone's always, oh, office is dead, never going to work in an office again. What are you seeing from your perspective in the office world?
Well, there is some of that. Let's face it, we've had a pretty big behavioral change since COVID occurred. So I do think the work from home, flexible work environment, although frankly, I think a lot of people have been doing flexible work environment for a long time. I actually had my own company for a while and was pretty flexible with my employees. So that's been around. But the work from home scenario is new, obviously, the last few years. And I do think that that's here to stay. So that's had a fairly significant negative impact on current space users who have contracted their footprint as a result, and it's had a negative impact on demand. So it's not great. Does that mean that office is dead? No, I don't think so. I think there's a lot of space on the market to absorb. Um, but as the economy recovers and companies grow, not all that growth is going to be in people's living rooms and dens or at their apartments. So I think office is far from dead. It's just going to take a while to get back to a very healthy vacancy rate.
I know you mentioned flex office. What is flex office? Because the word flex is thrown around so often in the real estate world. What do you see as flex office?
That is a great question, and I'm glad you asked it because I actually ask the same question frequently. People talk about flex, and the first thing I say is, "All right, so let's get straight with each other. Are we talking about flex, as in a long time ago? I was at a public company, and we were buying flex properties in Florida, and that was single-story commercial space, some component of which was office and some component was warehouse or distribution space. And so, depending on where the wall between those two uses or three uses occurred, that was flex. You could flex to more office, you could flex to more distribution space. That's not really what people are talking about today. What people are talking about today is really, I think, a better way to describe it is flex term space or flexible term space. And that's a completely different animal. That's regular office space where the terms are flexible for the tenant. So, in other words, they don't have to sign up for a 5, 7, 10-year deal. It could be a 6-month, 9-month, 12-month, 18-month sort of flexible environment, kind of like the way WeWork was using enterprise space.
So what's driving the demand ultimately? Because it seems to be um, intuitive, but why is it now that we're starting off with more flexible space, and what's kind of holding it back?
Yeah. So it's interesting, sort of, I would say let's start with how did that evolve? How did we get to where we are today? Because it's relatively new. I mean, I've been a landlord for over 35 years, and with the exception of co-working, which is a type of flexible space, let's put that on the side. for the moment. Um, as a landlord, I was not very interested in flexible space because flexible term space is it's not really a value adder, so to speak, right? The way we create value in commercial real estate, office in particular, is by creating rent rolls that have a lot of credit and a lot of WALT, a lot of weighted average lease term. And flexible space doesn't do that, right? Flexible space is going to decrease your WALT, not increase your WALT. So that means when people value your building, um, they will probably, if you had a lot of flex space, or let's pretend you don't even have flex space, let's just pretend you have very short WALT, they're going to apply a much higher cap rate. So that result of that is less value. Um, so that's a big issue, and I'm not really sure we have clarity around an answer to that issue yet. That's a big concern actually for me as tenants continue to want and demand flex space. Um, it's great for cash flow, but it's not so great for actual value creation when you're capping it. I think it's new enough in the industry that we haven't really figured that out. Is there a time down the road where some portion of office buildings act like hotels, where tenants can come in on a very short term basis, and there's enough of those that the rollover is continual and the downtime is very small and it actually behaves like a hotel? And then you can apply a lower cap rate to that and it's not a value inhibitor. That's possible, but we're not there yet. So from the landlord's perspective, I think it's a challenge.
It,
From the tenant's perspective, totally get why they want it. Um, tenants want what they want, and then it's a question of can they get it in the marketplace. And having flexibility or optionality is always great for tenants. I mean, it just makes sense. If you put yourself in their shoes, I completely understand why they want that.
yeah, so I wanted to touch on that. So one of the things that we've been seeing consistently as an operator of office in the Chicagoland area, we have about 2 million square feet, I would say, give or take 100,000. And how we've seen it consistently is our small flexible spaces have been great at reducing vacancy, great at bringing people in the building, and even as incubator spaces or semi incubator spaces.
Sure.
But overwhelmingly, they take a lot of effort, and in terms of the build out costs that we're seeing today, they're not often really that profitable or even profitable at all. I'm curious if you're seeing that kind of in your portfolios, if office is kind of or flex office is kind of like a semi incubator space, or if it's actually a pretty profitable avenue.
Well, it can definitely act like that. And I would agree with you. We're seeing the same things, which is why I think there's friction between owners and users right now on this topic. Um, I want to touch on your cost comment for a second because I think that's a really great point. What I found is, let's say on a 7-year lease in a good submarket, you might have to spend $75 a foot in TI today to get a
Oh
Class
yeah,
A tenant into their suite, right? Um, for flexible term space to really work, it has to be super attractive. There was a long period of time where spec suites were a great thing to have. They still are a great thing to have. And in the beginning, people would build out spec suites similar to a regular tenant space. And then people found, well, let's add some bells and whistles to make it even more attractive. And then most recently, I think I've seen spec suites where landlords are spending $125 a foot to make
yes,
them, it's almost like they've become extravagant
oh
to
yeah,
be super attractive so that they lease quickly. That's great. But and again, if you're leasing them, it's really great for cash flow. So, and I want to circle back to that for a second. So that's great for cash flow because you've got space that maybe would have sat vacant until you built it out for a longer term tenant. It's now leased. You're now collecting money on it. It was expensive to build, but the fact is you're collecting money and it's no longer vacant. So that's great. Um, Again, I come back to if it's not term and you go to sell the building, then how is that space going to be capped? Let's pretend you have a building that's 50% dedicated to flexible term space and 50% normal office, and it's 100% leased. So your buyer comes in and they say, fine, let's say before interest rates and all that other stuff, they'd say, fine, we'll apply a 7.5 cap rate to that, to your 50% that's leased with 7 years of WALT on it. Well, if you've done a bunch of 1-year deals or 18-month deals or even 2-year deals on the other 50% of the building, and let's say there are 10 tenants that make up that 50%, what cap rate are you applying to those? There's really no WALT, and your cost to build was super high. So to me, that becomes a problem. Now, my viewpoint is coming to you from historically a value add buyer of office, an owner of office. So I'm not really a very long-term holder. 3 to 5 years is our typical hold period. So what I just described doesn't work great for that guy, for that office owner. Where maybe it does work well is, suppose you have, and there are these types, like REITs would be a really good example, where cash flow is important. And they're going to be a very long holder of the real estate for a very long period of time. They're less concerned about what is my exit cap rate, because there are going to be peaks and valleys that they'll work their way through, and they'll sell at a more strategic time. So they're not so worried about cap rate. Cash flow is great. So I think there is a place here for everybody, but I do think it depends on who the owner is of the asset and then who the users are. I hope that makes sense.
So I'm curious from what you're seeing in your area of the market, right? Because we're in different markets, and that's why we love this
Yes.
podcast, right?
Right.
So in terms of what you're seeing in the Southeast and kind of in the Sun Belt and areas that have really seen less of the decline from COVID, is the national vacancy rate, you think, the primary driver of the rise of flex space, that office landlords are much more willing to kind of bend over backwards for tenants? Or do you think it's a change of demand?
Um, there's a lot there. I think that, let's face it, it doesn't matter if you're A property owner, B property owner, C property owner, if you're public, if you're private, if you're a long-term holder or you're a short-term flipper, our enemy is vacancy. That's a fact,
100%.
right?
100%.
And so I think what real estate owners do is they attack that problem. And so office building owners are a pretty competitive, smart group of people, and they will compete. And so if I think they'll consider anything if they think it leads to space being leased. Now the question becomes is, okay, you can lease the space, but is that a good thing to do? And I think that's where the friction comes in. Um, Spec suites, I'm a big fan of, because typically the term there is going to be 3 to 5 years. At least that's what we've experienced. We don't really do 2-year or 1-year spec suite deals. So we like that, and that solves a lot of problems for us. Shorter term, I think, does create a problem depending on what kind of owner you are, as I described before. But again, people are going to do it because if it leases space and it solves a problem, then maybe that's a good thing. And sometimes, depending on the pressures you're under, you may just want to solve a short-term problem and worry about the long-term repercussions of that later.
You've been very successful in the Southeast, particularly at developing pretty solid leasing strategies and flex leasing strategies. So I'm curious, like, what's your ideal strategy going forward for developing flex space that works for that 5-year timeline?
Yeah. I think in the assets that we own and going forward, I think there's a portion of a building that we would own that we would like to dedicate to some kind of flexible. Now, real estate is a very local business, so I think it varies greatly from place to place, city to city, submarket to submarket. But we have moved in this direction and we've been successful, and we'll continue to do this going forward. Um, Again, we've dedicated floors to spec suites, so that's been successful. To actually flexible term space, some space in your building. I don't know if that's 10% or 15%. I start to get a little bit uncomfortable if it becomes more than that for the reasons we talked about. But again, that's the kind of owner we are. But I think what will happen is different owners will develop their own strategy tailor made for them, where there's some portion of their building that's dedicated to that.
So when you're talking about flex terms, we've been very hesitant to go in and go below the 6 month range. You just start to have all sorts of costs that add up, and to
Sure.
amortize them over a 6 month lease, it just doesn't work. It tends to lose money. Um, when you get to that 6 to 12 month range, that's kind of our bread and butter. You start to have folks where they want to stay a little longer, or even if the lease doesn't work out, you don't really lose money. Is that kind of what you're seeing in terms of your bread and butter, or are you looking for, that 1 or that 2 month lease?
No, not the 1 or 2 month lease. I mean, for me, short term would be a year plus. I don't even think we would do anything that's less than a year. A year to 2 years is what I really think of in terms of flexible term space. And the one thing we haven't talked about that comes with flexible term space is there is a rent premium that comes with
Oh
that.
yeah.
So that does help offset things. It is very interesting what that premium can be. Um, we had WeWork as a tenant, and they defaulted, and we inherited some of their tenants and got a real good look at the rent they were paying. Um, those tenants, I mean, for flexible term space, 18-month, 2 year space. And I'll be honest with you, I was shocked at what the premium was. Now, WeWork delivered services along with that um, justified that premium. And we wouldn't deliver those same services. So maybe we get less of a premium, but I'll try to be a little bit more concrete with you. In a building where our rent was $32, there were WeWork tenants paying in the low 50s. That's massive.
Yeah.
So, but again, there's a variety of reasons for that, and some of those things we just can't do.
That's been something that we've really worked with some of our landlords. Is there's, I think, a really fine line and what kind of services tenants demand and what services that they're willing to pay for, and then that are just absolute luxuries that really don't add substantial value to the space and improve your leasing. What have you found in terms of what are the services that tenants tend to demand in those kind of spaces versus what are the services that are just extravagant luxuries?
Yeah, and I'm not sure if you differentiate between services and amenities, but I love to have this conversation because I find that in commercial real estate, there's sort of the issue du jour in a way, and that issue might last for it could maybe longer than a day, but it could be years. But even in lease negotiations, it seems like there's always some hot button that every tenant is focused on for a year, and then a year later, it's some other clause in the lease that everybody's attacking. So I think amenities. I would call that an issue du jour. It's lasted a lot longer than a day.
Look, brokers are herd creatures. It's fine.
But we focused on it because again, um, like my answer earlier, office guys are competitive, or office people are competitive, office owners are competitive, and office owners will do whatever they have to do to win tenants. So it was easier years ago when people said, well, look, having a great fitness center or having a fitness center is where it started. Having a fitness center and being green is really good. And then it was fitness, recycling program, green, lead, energy efficient. I mean, all these things just all the time, nonstop. The list keeps growing. All good things. Um, More recently, since COVID, battling work from home is okay. So the tenant's problem is also the landlord's problem because the tenant needs to attract employees and they need to put those employees, they need to have space that is attractive, right? So, what are the amenities that tenants want? I've spent a pretty fair amount of time looking at this. There is no one size fits all, there is no easy answer. Um, it's actually, it's very divergent actually from A to C. So we are not um, a midtown, downtown, high rise, class A, trophy, best in class office owner. That's not who we are. Um, we are a B plus to A minus suburban with some urban property value add company. So we like to find things that are broken, go in and do a big capex spend to make them pretty and fix the problems, and then increase the rent and lease them. So having the right amenities to us is very important. Um, so we surveyed our tenants about a year ago because we wanted to make our tenants sticky. And we thought, well, look, if we provide the right set of amenities, that's going to help. It'll help our renewal, our retention rate, it'll help attract new tenants. So we surveyed our tenants, and I was pretty shocked. I was expecting we want hub space, we want social space, we want state of the art fitness. We want state of the art meeting rooms with all the AV equipment. We want specially cleaned air in the building. We want all these things, right? Yoga on the lawn. We want it all, and that's actually not what we heard for our tenant class, which again I would describe as B class, B plus class. The answer was pretty clear. It was we want very well managed property. We want it to be we're in the South, so we want it to be cold, right? In the summer, we want clean, cold, cheap space. There were very few tenants that said, "I want a fitness room, I want meeting space, I want these other things." Now, if you surveyed that super duper high end trophy space, super duper credit, you're going to get a very different answer. You're going to get fitness is incredibly important, meeting space is incredibly important, green initiatives are incredibly important. All these other things are incredibly important. So I think the answer to the services and amenities is if you're a property owner, I think you have to know who your audience is and you have to cater to your audience.
I couldn't agree with you more. We're going to put a link up in the podcast to another podcast that we talked about surveys because that's important. But in terms of surveying, I think it's one of the most important things that you can do is survey your tenants because in our market, we found very similar things. It's a little different than the South. So like people wanted really great parking in terms of either covered parking or close parking because the Chicago winter is pretty brutal.
Sure.
Um, but in terms of that, I couldn't recommend that anymore. So
Yeah.
for anybody who's an investor or a broker who's out there who's trying to lease their properties, survey your tenants, and there are really good methods to survey your tenants that you should follow. Don't just send out a random survey monkey.
Yeah.
In terms of going forward and trying to understand what actually does lease though and what is effective in terms of long-term leases for space valuations, how does somebody take that short-term tenant and create a value add for a long-term tenant? Or is that something that we're still in the process of working out? Because I know for us, we've seen some success in kind of building on that and building on startups, but we're still kind of in the process of creating a long-term solution to kind of reconfigure perceptions of office space. How do you make that jump from that 1 year tenant to 5 year and premium class A minus space?
Yeah. Again, there's probably like no one answer for that. You made the comment earlier about some of the shorter term tenants acting like incubators. I think that's true, and we've definitely had many examples of that. Um, so I think that's a plus. Again, even if you're leasing on short term basis, cash flow is good. Um, and again, I don't mean to over harp on this, but I think it really depends on who you are as an investor and who you are as an owner. I think really that's where the answer lies. If you're a shorter term holder, um, flexible term is going to be tough for you to wrangle with. If you're a longer term holder, I think it's more sensible.
What do you think is the biggest barrier ultimately for flex space valuation in the short term? Because I know you've consistently mentioned it, and I think that's something that a lot of people who are maybe looking at that 5 year plan are a
Yeah.
little worried about.
Well, it's new. I mean, it's a new concept. And I think it's going to take us a little while as an industry to figure that out. So anytime you have anything new and immature, the people don't really know what to do with it or to how to value it, how to treat it, because they don't know how it behaves. So I think it's going to take us a little bit of time. I feel pretty confident saying that if you had a building, if you had an 80,000 foot building and it was all short term flexible leases, I think you'd probably have a very high cap rate applied to it because people would not have the confidence
Yeah.
in um, in will that always have some level of dependable occupancy associated with it. Again, I refer to will office one day or portions of office one day evolve into a hotel-like scenario where maybe to your point, 6 month term would not be abnormal. It could be more normal. That's possible. We may end up there. I think that's going to take time. And before buyers start applying um, reasonable cap rates to that space, it's going to have to prove itself out, right? Dependability, cap rates are all about dependability, right? And so right now, I think it's not dependable. It's undependable, and that time will fix that. Eventually, time will tell us if that concept evolves and it becomes dependable. Then it'll be treated differently in valuations.
Look, we're certainly living in the world of known unknowns. That's definitely
Yes.
true, and we talk about this. I wanted to know one thing though that I think you could be able to provide a unique insight into. So one of the things that we've struggled with, and we've now kind of gotten very effective at it, is kind of creating long-term procedures to deal with this changing reality. And one of the hard things is like training staff on site to deal with 6 month or 12-month leases because it's constant renewals and it's almost more like a residential circumstance than it is a traditional office lease where you're doing your five and your tens. Um, what are you seeing in terms of the training process and educating property managers and educating staff? Because you have a large enough portfolio that I think you have, a large enough group of staff.
Yes, it's a very good point, and it is different. It's actually a different mindset with the leasing team first, right? It starts with them. You have to change the way they think and the way that they're even marketing, approaching, being open to shorter term. So I think it starts with those people. And then, yes, it is definitely a little bit more burdensome on your property management team.
Yeah.
Um, Sometimes there are services you're providing with short term. Your move in, your move out, you're rolling over. Sometimes tenants can be unkind to the space, even if they're in there for um, 12 months. So on the way out, you may find yourself making repairs to or spending a little bit more TI on a space over and over again. I think when people do flexible term space well, like I said about spec suites, it's a pretty expensive build because you want it to be very attractive space. Um, so if you're doing it right, you're spending a lot of money up front to make it last for a long period of time. And then you're spending a little bit of money every time somebody rolls out.
Yeah.
Occasionally, we found on even where people want an 18-month term, they might ask you to move a couple walls, and then you've got a decision to make. If it's just a few walls, that's not really a big deal. If it becomes more than that, then again, you're starting to drive your cost up, and we don't love that, of course.
I mean, it's a hard thing to adapt to and a totally different mindset. For any of the investors out there who have buildings who are looking at reevaluating and trying to do something new and add flexible space, what would you say is ultimately, the strategies that they can adopt to do this besides training their staff?
Yeah. Here's what I wouldn't do. I would not jump in with both feet and take a third of your building and turn it into short-term space, flexible term space. You're the market you're in might not even want that. So I think, like anything else with investment, I think you really need to do your homework. You need to make sure that your market support is there. spend a lot of time with the tenant rep community. We spend a ton of time and make a ton of effort with the tenant rep community for leasing in general. Those guys know their clients, they know what they want, they know their needs. They're happy to communicate with landlords. So I would talk to them a lot to make your decision. And then I would try to remain fairly conservative. I would stick my toe in the pool, but do it in a small way to begin with. And if it works, then grow it a little bit. But just because you build out short-term space also doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to lease. And we've had a floor or a half a floor here and there that we built out, made the investment, marketed, and it took a long time for it to lease. We eventually leased it, but I would say our expectations were for better results than we had in those examples.
Look, we started in our portfolio with 10 spaces, and now we're pretty substantial, maybe 10 or 15% of the total portfolio. I definitely would say dip your toe in the water. Don't jump in and do a cannonball because you're
Right.
going to learn so much. So one of the things that we like to learn on our podcast about is we like to do this thing called the Final Four. And
Okay.
that's where we learn a little bit more about you, a little bit more about kind of your philosophy on life, and a little bit more about your philosophy on real estate or the business world. And so one of my favorite questions that we ask is 10 years from now, what do you think is going to have changed most about the real estate world?
Hmm. Um, well, I think you can see it coming now. I think technology um, is a huge factor in real estate in general. I mean, think about where we were 10 years ago and where we are today. It's pretty interesting all the things that have happened. Um, just simple things like VTS, for example, is a really good tool a lot of people use. It gives you on your phone, it gives you insight into your total leasing pipeline at every building you own in a very detailed, sophisticated way. Um, that's great. It's been around for more than 10 years, but not a lot longer than 10 years. Um, all of the energy management tools in buildings, excuse me, all of the technology that we have in buildings today that we didn't have not that long ago, I think that just gets better and better and better. I think buildings become more energy efficient, better for the environment, lower carbon footprints, all these things. I think just the sophistication of real estate as an industry, I can clearly see that happening and continuing over the next 10 years.
Look,
That would be one. The other would be just use. And I don't just mean office space. I mean, I think the way that the world is changing rapidly. And I think the way people approach all real estate, inline stores, inline retail stores, malls, hotels, short term rentals, as an example. There's a short term rental industry that's popping up right now and maturing right in front of our eyes. Apartment like units that you can rent on more like hotel like stays. So instead of renting it for 1 year, you can rent it for a couple nights or a week or a few weeks. Really, that's flexible term apartment. That's changing. So I think all of those things continue to evolve and mature over the next 10 years.
I think that's a very interesting point. I've heard one individual on our podcast say that real estate is going to evolve into much more of a consumer good than it previously has, and definitely, based on our discussion of flex space, I think we're headed in that direction. But in terms of going and heading back, one of the things we love to do on this podcast is head back in time. And Drew, if you could tell yourself, a 1 minute spiel about uh, advice that you could give at the start of your career, what would that be?
Um, that's a good question. I'd say the number one thing, and I talk to a lot of younger people who are graduating college and want to get into real estate. I seem to get pinged. I have three sons, so their friends ping me about a career in real estate. Probably the number one thing I tell them that I really wasn't focused on when I got into it is it's a cyclical business. And so you have to be prepared for the ups and downs. You have to be prepared for the cycles, and not everybody's built for that.
Oh
So
yeah.
it takes a certain kind of person. Some of us prefer to be steady, a steady eddy, less fluctuation, less ups and downs. So if you want a career in real estate, you have to understand its peaks and valleys, and you have to know how to navigate your way through those. So when things are going well, sock money away, and be smart, because eventually bad things happen, and then you'll have some lean years. But that all continues to ebb and flow, right? It comes and goes. So, but that's probably my best advice. I don't really think people necessarily focus on that when they're young. I wish I had been more aware of that myself when I was young.
Look, I honestly wish enough young brokers took that mentality. As somebody who's fourth generation, I've seen ups and downs in my childhood, and I understand that the market can be terrible. And sometimes
Right,
I mean, like during COVID, there was one point, and look, a huge portion of my portfolio is industrial, but still, there was that down period where it was like basically 3 months where there was like almost nothing going on because everyone
right,
was so scared, and um, there was 3 months where I made no deals, no commission, $0, right? And so for brokers who are young and starting out in the trade, I think there's been this Goldilocks period between 2020 and 2023 where people made so much money. And now they sit back and they think, oh, the good times are just going to keep rolling, right? That's probably not the case. And I think there are plenty of investment brokers and office brokers and all sorts of brokers all over the world that are about to really struggle. And I just really hope that they saved up a little nest egg because it's going to be potentially a rough next 18 to 36 months. But
yeah. Well, imagine you graduated college and you got into the brokerage business or real estate in 2010, right?
yeah.
I mean, you've had a nice run, and you've never really seen, right? You've never seen bad. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
you're seeing bad now, but bad happens. It comes, and I've got guys on my leasing team, third party providers. The Cushmans and the JLLs and the CBs. I mean, those guys. I mean, some of them they haven't done a deal in a year or two,
Oh, yeah.
and it's really hard. And these are like very successful people, who've done extremely well in their career, made lots of money, and are great people. Um, this is tough on them. So you definitely need to understand that, and you need to be smart when you're winning.
And the last thing, I know I can be a little bit of a sap on this podcast, but if you do have a friend in brokerage that might be going through a hard time, reach out and give them a call because I know enough
Absolutely.
people who are really mentally struggling right now, and sometimes a call can save a life. It really can. So, um, on a happier note, let's go and switch over to books. So one of the things we love on this podcast is books, and it could be audiobooks. It could be, you're an avid reader. What's a book that's changed your life, and that somebody who's interested in business or real estate or just life should pick up and read?
Sure. Oh gosh. I hope this isn't too much of a corny answer, but first of all, I work very hard, so I like to shut off with trashy books or lousy TV shows or sports. That's what I do to shut my brain off. Um, there's a book that I thought was just fantastic. Lone Survivor is one of my
Oh
favorite
yeah,
books. That's not, I wouldn't call that a trashy book at all, but I mean, that's a book where you're reading for just pure mental relief and excitement. It's an incredible story about Navy SEALs. It turned into a movie, and so that's probably one of my favorite books that I've ever read, um, just for pleasure. On the business side, I would say I'm a big fan of Ray Dalio. A Changing World, I think, is his last book that he wrote. I'm from Long Island. Ray is on Long Island currently. Obviously, a very, very super successful guy. But A Changing World is a super interesting book because it really talks about the evolution of people and societies and debt and how they peak and they crash. And I would say it's a very apropos read for today with all of the debt issues that we have going on and all of the geopolitical problems that we have right now. Um, it's a really heavy read, but the way he writes the books is he highlights things for you in the book, sort of this is important and it's highlighted, so it makes it kind of a really interesting read. But that's one that I happen to like in particular.
Hey, I got to check that out. He sounds like a true business manager, highlighting the important
Right.
segments of the book.
That's right.
Yeah, Marcus Luttrell and
Exactly.
the Navy SEALs. That's a phenomenal book. I would
It's a great book.
also highly recommend it. I think I read that the summer before I went to law school, and great book. So, in terms of the most important question on this podcast, we bring on folks like you, Drew, because you're a man or a person in the arena who's really knows what's going on. And it doesn't matter if you're in business, if you're in real estate, if you're in any section of the world, you tend to know and have a unique insight into who are the people that we should be bringing on next. So, who's the next guest we should bring on the podcast?
So there's a lot of, first of all, real estate is made up of commercial real estate. Um, the office building business is what I know best. It's made up of a lot of great people. It's one of the great attractions about working in this industry is the people are great. They love to have a good time. They love to have fun. There's a lot of there's just a lot of good things that go on. So it's a great social business as well. So it's hard to pick, but I would say for me, there's one voice out there right now that seems to be kind of in front of the pack, and I would say that's Scott Reckler at RXR.
Okay, all right.
Another Long Island guy, actually, as it happens. But I think everything that I hear coming out of Scott is kind of right on, and I think he's the kind of guy that doesn't really mind, really, even if it's unpopular, he's going to hit you right between the eyes with reality, which I really appreciate. And he's out there being pretty vocal about what's happening, the impact of debt, the impact of interest rates, rising cap rates, tenants' use of office, repurposing buildings. I mean, he's a very smart guy, very successful guy, and I like his clarity and his approach. So I'm a big fan of him. If you could get Scott on your podcast, that would be a good land, I think.
Look, I'd love to reach out. That sounds like a terrific voice to bring on. And so we have one final question, and it's not necessarily part of the final four, but it's an important question nonetheless. And it's if somebody wants to reach out to you, Drew, what's the best way that they can get in contact?
Email is probably good, and that's D like Drew D Cunningham at Dilweg DILWEG.com.
Drew, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast today, and we have to have you on in the future.
Thank you, Gordon. I appreciate it. It was fun. So thanks a lot.
Thanks again to Drew. If you enjoyed the podcast, please give us a like, a follow, a subscription. All your interactions truly matter and help us get guests like Drew. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Gordon Lamphere with the Real Finds Podcast. Thank you for listening.